what does this civilization on Mars look like? So do you think we would more and more, maybe start with some genetic modification and then move to basically cyborgs, increasing integration of electronic systems, computational systems into our bodies and brains?
This is a theme of my other new book out this year, which is called The End of Astronauts. And
The
it's
end of astronauts.
co-written with my old friend and colleague from Berkeley, Don Goldsmith. And it's really about the role of human spaceflight versus sort of robotic spaceflight. And just to summarize what it says, it argues that the practical case for sending humans into space is getting weaker all the time as robots get better and more capable. Robots 50 years ago couldn't do anything very much, but now they could assemble big structures on space or in space or on the moon, and they could probably do exploration. Well, present ones on Mars can't actually do the geology, but future AI will be able to do the geology, and already they can dig on Mars. And so if you want to do exploration of Mars, and of course, even more of Enceladus or Europa, where you could never send humans, we depend on robots. And they're far, far cheaper, because to send a human to Mars requires feeding them for 200 days on the journey there and bringing them back. And neither of those are necessary for robots. So the practical case for humans is getting very, very weak. And if humans go, it's only as an adventure, really. And so the line in our book is that human spaceflight should not be pursued by NASA or public funding agencies because it has no practical purpose, but also because it's especially expensive if they do it, because they would have to be risk averse in launching civilians into space. I can illustrate that by noting that the shuttle was launched 135 times, and it had 2 spectacular failures, which each killed the 7 people in the crew. It had been mistakenly presented as safe for civilians, and there was a woman school teacher killed in one of them. It was a big national trauma, and they tried to make it safer still. But if you launch into space just the kind of people prepared to accept that sort of risk, and of course test pilots and people who go hang gliding and go to the South Pole, etc., are prepared to accept a 2% risk at least for a big challenge, then of course you do it more cheaply. And that's why I think human spaceflight should be left to the billionaires and their sponsors, because then the taxpayers aren't paying, and they can launch simply those people who are prepared to accept high risks. Space adventure, not space tourism.
Yeah.
And we should cheer them on. As regards where they would go, then low Earth orbit, I suspect, can be done quite cheaply in future. But going to Mars, which is very, very expensive and dangerous for humans, the only people who would go would be these adventurers, maybe on a one-way trip, like some of the early polar explorers and Magellan and people like that, and we would cheer them on. And I expect, and I very much hope, that by the end of a century, there will be a small community of such people on Mars, living very uncomfortably, far less comfortably than at the South Pole or the bottom of the ocean or the top of Everest. But they will be there, and they won't have a return ticket, but they'll be there. Incidentally, I think it's a dangerous illusion to think, as Elon Musk has said, that we can have mass emigration from the Earth to Mars to escape the Earth's problems. It's a dangerous illusion because it's far easier to deal with climate change on Earth than to terraform Mars to make it properly habitable to humans. And so there's no planet B for ordinary risk-averse people. But for these crazy adventurers, then you can imagine that they would be trying to live on Mars as great pioneers. And by the end of the century, then there will be huge advances compared to the present in two things. First, in understanding genetics, so as to genetically redesign one's offspring. And secondly, to use cyborg techniques to implant something in our brain, or indeed think about downloading, etc. And those techniques will, one hopes, be heavily regulated on Earth on prudentials and ethical grounds. And of course, we are pretty well adapted to the Earth, so we don't have the incentive to do these things in the way they were there. So our argument is that it'll be those crazy pioneers on Mars using all these scientific advances, which will be controlled here, away from the regulators. They will transition into a new post-human species. Mm-hmm. And so if they do that, and if they transition into something which is electronic eventually, because there may be some limits to the capacity of flesh and blood brains anyways, then those electronic entities may not want to stay on a planet like Mars. They may want to go away. And so they'll be the precursors of the future evolution of life and intelligence coming from the Earth. And of course, there's one point which perhaps astronomers are more aware of than most people. Most people are aware that we are the outcome of 4 billion years of evolution. Most of them, nonetheless, probably think that we humans are somehow the culmination, the top of the tree. But yes, no astronomers can believe that, because astronomers know that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. The sun has been shining for that length of time, but the sun has got 6 billion years more to go before it flares up and engulfs the inner planets. So the sun is less than halfway through its life, and the expanding universe goes on far longer still, maybe forever. And I like to quote Woody Allen, who said, "Eternity is very long, especially towards the end." So we shouldn't think of ourselves as maybe even the halfway stage in the emergence of cosmic complexity. And so these entities who are postcursors, they will go beyond the solar system. And of course, even if there's nothing else out there already, then they could populate the rest of the galaxy.
And maybe eventually meet the others who are out there expanding as well.
Yeah.
Expanding and populating.
Yes.
With expanded capacity for life and intelligence, all those kinds of things.
Well, they might, but again, all better off, because I can't conceive what they'd be like. They won't be green men and women with eyes on stalks. They'd be something quite different. We just don't know. But there is an interesting question, actually, which comes up when I've sometimes spoken to audiences about this topic, that the question of consciousness and self-awareness. Because going back to philosophical questions, I mean, it's whether an electronic robot would be a zombie, or would it be conscious and self-aware? And I think there's no way of answering this empirically. Some people think that consciousness and self-awareness is an emergent property in any sufficiently complicated network, so they would be. Others say, well, maybe it's something special to the flesh and blood that we're made of. We don't know. And in a sense, this may not matter to the way things behave, because they could be zombies and still behave as though they were intelligent. But I remember after one of my talks, someone came up and said, wouldn't it be sad if these future entities, which were the main intelligence in the universe, had no self-awareness? So there was nothing which could appreciate the wonder and mystery of the universe and the beauty of the universe in the way that we do. And so it does perhaps affect one's perspective of whether you welcome or deplore this possible future scenario, depending on whether you think the future post-human entities are conscious and have an aesthetic sense, or whether they're just zombies.
And of course, you have to be humble to realize that self-awareness may not be the highest form of being, that humans have a very strong ego and a very strong sense of identity, like personal identity connected to this particular brain. It's not so obvious to me that is somehow the highest achievement of a life form. that maybe this kind
You think
of,
something collective would be
it's
better?
possible
Yeah, yeah.
that, well, I think from an alien perspective, when you look at Earth, it's not so obvious to me that individual humans are the atoms of intelligence. It could be the entire organism together, the collective intelligence. And so we humans think of ourselves as individuals. We dress up, we wear ties and suits, and we give each other prizes. But in reality, the intelligence, the things we create that are beautiful, emerges from our interaction with each other. And that may be where the intelligence is. Ideas jumping from one person to another over generations.
Yes, but we have experiences where we can appreciate
Yes.
beauty and wonder and all that. And a zombie may not have those experiences.
Yeah. Or it may have a very different,
Very
we have a
different,
very
yeah.
black and white, harsh description of like a philosophical zombie. That could be just a very different way to experience. Uh, and, in terms of the explorers that colonize Mars, I mean, there's several things I want to mention. One, it's just at a high level. To me, that's one of the most inspiring things humans can do, is reach out into the unknown. That's in the space of ideas, in the space of science, but also the explorers.
Yes, no, I agree with that.
And that inspires people here on Earth more. I mean, it did in their, when going to the moon or going out to space in the 20th century, that inspired a generation of scientists. I think that also could be used to inspire a generation of new scientists in the 21st century by reaching out towards Mars. So, in that sense, I think what Elon Musk and others are doing is actually quite inspiring.
No, I agree. Yeah.
It's not a recreational thing. It's actually has a deep humanitarian purpose of really inspiring the world. And then on the other one, to push back on your thought, I don't think Elon says we want to escape Earth's problems. It's more that we should allocate some small percentage of resources to have a backup plan. And because
yes,
you yourself have spoken about and written about all the ways we clever humans
we
can destroy ourselves.
Yes, yes.
And I'm not sure, it does seem, when you look at the long arc of human history, it seems almost obvious that we need to become a multiplanetary species over a period if we are to survive many centuries. It seems that as we get clever and clever with the ways we can destroy ourselves, Earth is going to become less and less safe. So in that sense, this is one of the things, people talk about climate change and that we need to respond to climate change, and that's a long-term investment we need to make. But it's not really long-term. It's a span of decades. I think what Elon is doing is a really long-term investment. We should be working on multiplanetary colonization now if we were to have it ready 5 centuries from now. And so taking those early steps, and then also there's something happens when when you go into the unknown and do this really difficult thing, you discover something very new. You discover something about robotics or materials engineering or nutrition or neuroscience or human relations or political systems that actually work well with humans. You discover all those things. And so it's worthy effort to go out there and try to become cyborgs.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think the only different point I'd make is that this is going to be very expensive if it's done in a risk-averse way. And that's why I think we should be grateful to the billionaires if they're going to sort of foster these opportunities for thrill-seeking risk takers who we can all admire.
Yeah. By the way, I should push back on the billionaires because there's sometimes a negative connotation to the word billionaire. It's not a billionaire. It's a company versus government, because governments are billionaires and trillionaires.
Yeah,
It's not. It's not the wealth. It's the capitalist imperative. So, which I think deserves a lot more praise than people are giving it. I'm troubled by the sort of criticism like it's billionaires playing with toys for their own pleasure. I think what some of these companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin are doing is some of the most inspiring engineering and even scientific work ever done in human history.
No, I agree. I think the people who've made the greatest wealth are people who've really been mega benefactors. I mean, I think uh,
Some of them, some of them.
yeah, yes, some of them, but those who've founded Google and all that, and even Amazon, they're beneficiaries. Then they're quite different category, in my view, from those who just shuffle around money, or or crypto coins and things like that, who are
Or now
doing the
you're really
negative.
talking
Yes, yes,
trash.
yes.
I like it.
But I think if they use their money in these ways, that's fine. But I think it's true that far more money is owned by us collectively as taxpayers. But I think the fact is that in a democracy, there'd be big resistance to exposing human beings to very high risks, if in a sense we share responsibility for it.
Yeah, I don't
And
know.
then
So
and that's the reason I think it could be done much more cheaply by these private funders.
that's an interesting hypothesis, but I have to push back. I don't know if it's obvious why NASA spends so much money and takes such a long time to develop the things it was doing. So before Elon Musk came along, because I would love to live in a world where government actually uses taxpayer money to get some of the best engineers and scientists in the world and actually work across governments, Russia, China, United States,
Yeah, yeah,
European Union together to do some of these big projects. It's strange that Elon is able to do this much cheaper, much faster. It
yes.
could have to be do with risk aversion. You're right, but I
Well, I
wonder.
think it's that he had all the whole assembly within this one building, as it were,
Yeah,
rather than depending on a supply chain.
yeah,
But I think it's also that he had a Silicon Valley culture and had younger people, whereas the big aerospace companies, Boeing and Lockheed Martin, they had people who were left over from the Apollo program in some cases, and so they weren't quite so lively. And indeed, quite apart from the controversial issues of the future of human spaceflight, in terms of the next generation of big rockets, then the one that Musk is going to launch for the first time this year, the huge one, is going to be far, far cheaper than the one that NASA's been working on at the same time. And that's because it will have a reusable first stage. And it's going to be great. It can launch over 100 tons into Earth orbit. And incidentally, that's going to make it feasible to do things that I used to think were crazy, like having solar energy from space. That's no longer so crazy if you can do that. And also for science, because its nose cone could contain within it something as big as the entire unfurled James Webb Telescope mirror. And therefore, you can have a big telescope much more cheaply if you can launch it all in one piece. And so it's going to be hugely beneficial to science and to any practical use of space to have these cheaper rockets that are far more completely reusable than any which NASA had. So I think Musk's done a tremendous service to the space exploration and the whole space technology through these rockets, certainly.
plus, it's some big, sexy rocket. It's just great engineering.
Of course, yeah,
It's like
absolutely.
looking at a beautiful big bridge that humans are capable, us descendants of apes are capable to do something so majestic.
Yes, and also the way they land coming down on
Yeah.
this bar, that's amazing.
It's both
Mm.
controls engineering, it's increasing sort of intelligence in these rockets, but also great propulsion engineering materials,
No,
entrepreneurship, and it just inspires so many people.
I'm entirely with you on that. Yeah. Mm.
So, would it be exciting to you to see a human being step foot on Mars in your lifetime?
Yes, I think it's unlikely in my lifetime since I'm so ancient, but I think this century it's going to happen, and I think that will indeed be exciting, and I hope there will be a small community by the end of a century. But as I say, I think they may go with one-way tickets or accepting the risk of no return. So they've got to be people like that, and I still think it's going to be hard to persuade the public to send people when you say straight out that they may never come back. But of course, the Apollo astronauts, they took a high risk. And in fact, in my previous book, I quote the speech that had been written for Nixon to be read out if Neil Armstrong got stuck on the moon. And it was written by one of his advisors, and a very eloquent speech, about how they would have come to a noble end, etc. But of course, there was a genuine risk at that time. But that may have been accepted. But clearly, the crashes of the shuttle were not acceptable to the American public, even when they were told that this was only a 2% risk, given how often they launched it. And so that's what leads me to think that it's got to be left to the kind of people who are prepared to take these risks. And I think of American Adventure as a guy called Steve Fossett, who was an aviator, did all kinds of crazy things, and then a guy who fell supersonically with a parachute from very high altitude. All these people, we all cheer them on. They extend the bounds of humanity. But I don't think the public will be so happy to fund them.
I mean, I disagree with that. I think if we change the narrative, we should change the story.
You think so?
I think there's a lot of people, because the public is happy to fund folks in other domains that take bold, giant risks. First of all, military, for example, military.
Oh, in the military, obviously, yes.
I think this is in the name of science, especially if it's sold correctly. I sure as hell would go up there with a risk. I would take a 40% chance risk of death for something that's.
I might want to be even older than I am now.
Well,
but then I would go.
I guess what I'm trying to communicate is there's a lot of people on Earth. That's the nice feature, and I'm sure there's going to be a significant percentage or some percentage of people that they take on the risk for the adventure. So, and I particularly love that risk of adventure when taking on inspires people, and just the ripple effect it has across a generation, especially among the young minds, is perhaps immeasurable. But you're thinking that sending humans should be something we do less and less, sending humans to space, that it should be primarily an effort. The work of space exploration should be done primarily by robots.
Well, I think it can be done much more cheaply, obviously, on Mars, and no one's thinking of sending humans to Enceladus or Europa. The outer planets. And the point is, we will have much better robots because, let's take an example. You've seen the pictures of the moons of Saturn and the picture of Pluto and the comet taken by probes. And Cassini spent 13 years going around Saturn and its moons after a 7-year voyage. And those are all based on 1990s technology. And if you think of how smartphones have advanced in the 20 years since then, just think how much better one could do instrumenting some very small, sophisticated probe and could send dozens of them to explore the outer planets. And that's the way to do that, because no one thinks you could send humans that far. But I would apply the same argument to Mars. And if you want to assemble big structures like, for instance, radio astronomers would like to have a big radio telescope on the far side of the moon, so it's away from the Earth's background artificial radio waves. And that could be done by assembling using robots without people. So on the moon and on Mars, I think everything that's useful can be done by machines much more cheaply than by humans.